help me welcome.
Hi, Bill. Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Chris. I will say that I'm not actually going to talk much about exercise. Physical activity and exercise are very different. So we're going to talk more about populations that pretty much, for the most part, don't exercise, which is all of ours. So I'm going to start out with just a little bit of background. As Chris said, I went to the University of Chicago. I did my PhD with a guy named Dale Scheller, and Dale, as we'll see in a few slides here, really changed the way we understand dietary intake, energy intake, as well as energy expenditure. And we'll talk a little bit about the methodology he sort of rediscovered in a couple of slides. But I was a lab scientist when I was at University of Chicago. I worked on mass spectrometers. My PhD actually was the design of an inlet system for a mass spectrometer. I did not go into nutrition to do that, but that's sort of how the cards fell when I was getting my doctorate. So as soon as I could, I turned down a bunch of postdocs to go and run labs, mass spec labs, and I said, no, I actually want to deal with humans. And so that's how I ended up at Loyola. And as Chris said, I came to Loyola, the chair was and still is Richard Cooper. And Richard Cooper's a cardiovascular epidemiologist who, and I was telling this to Liz earlier, who really, in the late 80s, there were, and well, even today, the concept of comparing African Americans and whites in the United States with regard to hypertension prevalence. So they would try to control for race or socioeconomic status by putting in a variable into the multivariate regression race, and then high school or education level, income level, and think that you've adjusted for the lived experiences of these two different populations. So Richard said, forget about that. We're going to go and actually take a look at hypertension prevalence and risk factors at populations across the African diaspora. Now, we're not saying they're genetically identical by any means, but by doing that, we were able to understand that those black-white differences in the United States that we see, as well as other biracial countries, I don't have the data here, but our recent data from South Africa show the same thing, is that we cannot capture the discrimination, the prejudice, the perceived discrimination, what have you, that actually are impacting health of African Americans in the United States. So to go back, so I'm using that same paradigm for my studies, and have always. So we don't compare between racial groups. And we just had a big discussion with medical students yesterday about what racial groups really mean. So, so anyway, we know that obesity, and so we're shifting gears from hypertension to obesity. Obviously, obesity is one of the primary risk factors for hypertension in any population. We know that across the world and across whatever WHO region you're looking at, the prevalence of hypertension is high and is growing. And it's a concern, as you can see, particularly in high-income countries, which is not all that surprising, right? If we take a look at, if you think of energy balance, which is energy intake equals energy expenditure, and if you have an imbalance in that, then either your body weight goes up, typically from fat stores, or your body weight goes down, typically from using fat stores. So if we take a look at what's happening as the world moves through a social and economic development, I don't know if that's a great term because it implies positive things, but changes, and put it in terms of energy intake and energy expenditure, you can see that we've had over the last 30 years, dramatic changes in the diet in all nations, basically. More people are moving into urban areas, as you all know, and we also have seen rapidly changing physical activity patterns as the structure of work has changed. So I'm in public health now. Started as a basic scientist, went into epidemiology, and now we're really focused on public health. So from a public health perspective, we would like to know what the most effective approach to preventing population level increases in excess weight. Is it the energy inside, or is it the energy outside of this energy balance equation? And as we saw in the previous slide, we've seen differences in both over the recently. So this whole question of whether it's energy in or energy out, I'm going to give you a little bit of history first, is not new. So Jean Mayer was one of the premier nutritionists for the early part of the middle part of the 20th century. So this was a study that was published in Clinical Nutrition Journal, and they looked at caloric intake of obese girls, caloric intake of non-obese girls, and then they had this index that they developed themselves. And so the take-home message from this paper was that on a statistical basis, inactivity was much more important than overeating in regards to the excess weight gain. And in fact, the caloric intake of the obese group was significantly lower than that of the non-obese group, with the relatively greater energy balance being consequently supplied by inactivity. That was the belief for a very, very long time. What is wrong? I mean, just in general terms, what might be wrong with these data? Not wrong, but, or maybe what might be wrong with the interpretation of these data? Anyone have an idea? As free living, it's been a problem in epidemiology forever.
Measurement.
Measurement of diet.
And what about that measurement of diet?
Underestimated.
Self-reported.
Self-reported.
It's self-reported, right? Not only was the energy intake or caloric intake self-reported, so was the activity index. So and I'll show you later on some of our recent work, which clearly shows there's a major problem with it. But it's always been a problem. But for decades and decades and decades, this general outcome was what we saw. There's something wrong with the adaptive processes in obese individuals. They eat less. We know they eat less. We have all these studies that show they eat less, and yet they gain weight. And just so because we're going to talk a lot about total energy expenditure and physical activity. If you have total daily energy expenditure, the more than 50%, usually 60 to 70% of it, is your metabolic rate, termed resting energy expenditure, resting metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate, etc. You have this little bit called thermic effect of food, and then you have the highly variable amount of physical activity, calories or joules spent in physical activity. We can measure metabolic rate very well. We can also measure the thermic effect of food pretty well using the same methodology, which is indirect calorimetry. But we can't measure physical activity well, right? So therefore we really didn't have an estimate of total energy expenditure. And just to point out that millions and millions of dollars were spent trying to understand why obese individuals were more efficient in processing their foods, so that they were able to either extract more energy from it, which is not possible, but more likely that it cost less energy for them to process that food and store it. Millions of dollars were spent on research in this thing called Luxus consumption. It's never been found. So then along came my advisor, Dale Scheller. Dale is an analytical chemist. He's now a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin because U of C didn't give him tenure after 25 years, but that's just that's a sideline. Does everyone know what the doubly labeled water method is? Yes? So I don't need to go through it.
Herman visited last year.
Okay, all right, perfect.
Yep.
Well, I've got a couple of Herman slides too. But Herman learned it from Dale too, so
Yeah.
pretty much everyone's learned it from Dale. So as you know, it gives an objective measure. For the first time, we had an objective measure of total energy expenditure. So you can measure your metabolic rate very well. We know after millions of dollars that between 8 and 10% of your total caloric intake is spent in that thermic effect of food measure. So now you can do simple algebra and calculate energy expended in physical activity with a high degree of. So this is my lab. This is what I did for 6 years at University of Chicago. So all of a sudden, in the mid-'80s, this methodology comes out and whoa, obese individuals actually expend more energy than lean individuals. It totally blew all those years of decades of self-reported energy intake data out the window. Makes total sense now. If you think about it from a whole animal perspective, it makes complete sense. But it completely switched nutrition sciences in the 80s, yeah.
I guess I'm just kind of curious, were people making these sorts of, were people pointing out the possible problems with that model when there was this dominant paradigm that was established that had people trying to reach for some secret physiological mechanism?
Oh, absolutely.
And then people were kind of making logical arguments, attempting to dispel that, but still all the money was going towards...
Yeah, well, by that time, I think money started shifting. I mean, it became pretty clear pretty quickly. And these studies were actually backed up with whole room calorimetry studies, which were done in a whole bunch of places. Problem with that, it's not free living. Doubly labeled water is free living. But it was pretty well accepted pretty quickly. So these guys at Cambridge, they were the smart ones. They took the method before it was clearly worked out and ran with it. And all of a sudden, it's like, now we understand where we've been wrong. Dale spent a lot of time, he's an analytical chemist, spent a lot of time tweaking out the methods. But he was recognized at the turn of the year 2000 as having one of the two most important nutrition discoveries, if you will. It was done in animals a long, long, long time ago, but for methodologic reasons, now it became practical to do it in the US. So I got into his lab in 1988. And as I said, I didn't want to work on obesity at that time. I was really interested in undernutrition. What I didn't realize is we really don't need a lot of research in undernutrition. We need programming to improve undernutrition. So I left U of C, went to Loyola as a postdoc. And early on in in 1988, this seminal paper came out, Reduced Rate of Energy Expenditure as a Risk Factor for Body Weight Gain. This was a paper done in the Southwest amongst the Pima Indians. And they had showed then, and they've subsequently shown in a couple of other papers, that lower resting energy expenditure, adjusted for body size, body composition, was lower REE predicted higher weight gain. And so that drove a lot of people in the 90s to take a look at the differences in resting energy expenditure between black and white individuals, particularly black women and white women. And what was found over and over again, except for the Foster paper, was that African American women, if you adjust for lean body mass or fat-free mass, that they have lower resting energy expenditures. These are all cross-sectional studies, but it was pretty consistent. Not 100%, but it was pretty consistent. There was a significant difference in metabolic rates in African American women. So again, cross-sectional studies, virtually every one of these papers ended with the line of, well, we think this is likely to be a cause of obesity in black women. What's the problem with that? But statistically, what's the problem with that? Or if you look at it epidemiologically, you're making a causal statement based on cross-sectional data. So that actually fueled my interest. And at that point, we had been doing, I've been working on Richard's hypertension work for a while. So I carted my huge indirect calorimeter, got a tank of gas, got a generator, because the Igor had no electricity. But we found that even though African American women and Nigerian women had very different rates of obesity, as you'll see, they had very comparable Again, cross-sectional, very comparable resting energy expenditures. So then, finally, I finally got funded to do a longitudinal study, to take a look at those energy parameters in relationship to subsequent weight gain. Okay. And so this is Igora Women's, Maywood Women's Study. Igora is in the southwestern Nigeria. It's in Yoruba speaking part of Nigeria. I spent, I think, over the last, I haven't gone in probably 10 years, but the first 10 years, I spent about a year in the village. So our specific aims were really simple, or our hypotheses, that activity energy expenditure and resting energy expenditure are independently inversely associated with adiposity and with weight change. In other words, the lower your physical activity, or here activity energy expenditure, the lower your resting metabolic rate, the more weight you will gain going forward. And so you guys know about doubly labeled water. You have to collect samples over a certain time period. I put a couple of, I had a graphic artist when Dale retired from the University of Wisconsin, put together some cartoons. So doing doubly labeled water, as you know, Bill, in the field can be very challenging at times, can it? Yeah.
Indeed.
So these were the baseline characteristics. I'm going to talk faster. Of the women in the study, we had about 150 in each group, and you can see 30 kilos different in weight. BMI was dramatically different. Percent body fat dramatically different. Fat-free mass, blah, blah, blah. Energy expenditure adjusted for body size, or activity energy expenditure adjusted for body size and composition didn't differ. And PAL, are you guys familiar with that? So physical activity level, it's not a good term, but it's total energy expenditure divided by resting metabolic rate. The theory is that you're adjusting for body size, and so you could compare across populations. There's a lot of problems with it, but it's used, WHO uses it to compare physical activity levels between populations. Virtually no difference in our groups. So we look at the frequency distributions of activity energy expenditure, or the number of calories spent in physical activity. We can take a look here. The dotted, this is unadjusted. The dotted lines are Maywood. Once we adjust for body size and composition, there's virtually no difference. Well, there is no difference. Not virtually.
Is this based on self-reported physical activity?
No, this is doubly
What's
labeled water measured and resting energy expenditure measured. So it's
so it's just you just subtract that.
Just subtract it out.
Activity.
Yeah, sorry.
Does that include thermal effect of food as well?
We estimate
You estimate
8 to
that.
10%. Yeah, just pick a number in there,
Okay.
and it's consistent. It's been thousands of studies that show it's
Yeah.
about 8 to 10%.
Yeah.
So cross-sectionally, we found no association and no meaningful association between adjusted energy expenditure and BMI, weight, percent body fat. We could throw any factor up there. So it's cross-sectional, right? It doesn't show anything about longitudinal relationships. So then we followed these women for 3 years and looked at their weight change. Both in Igor, it was about 1/2 kilo per year, and in Maywood, it was about 1/2 kilo per year. So this is resting energy expenditure. See, this is my setup. You can't see the generator, it's over here. There was no association at all. None at all. And we were like, wait a minute, this is not what we anticipated.
So this is baseline
Baseline,
resting energy expenditure measured.
Yep.
with your apparatus.
Predicting delta.
Delta over
weight.
3 years.
Yeah.
And everyone gained about 1.5 kilos
Mhm.
over the 3-year period. So 3 pounds.
Yep.
A little bit.
Most of that fat, which has very low metabolic rate. This is a standard theme. You'll see the same sort of analysis going forward. Then we looked at energy expended in physical activity. And so there's absolutely no association either. So we were actually, this went counter to our hypotheses.
Mhm.
We were kind of perplexed. And we published it, and we got a lot of pushback. you might guess. Anyway, I'm not going to go through this too much. This is a meta-analysis we did subsequent to the women's study. We pulled all the doubly labeled water studies that were out there, separated the countries. So meta-analysis is done on aggregate data, right? It's not individual data points. So we had low and middle. HDI stands for Human Development Index. It's a UN measure of sort of social and economic development within countries, and they rank every country in the world. US is not on top, just in case anyone was wondering. So we pulled so again, literature review, we pulled all the studies, broke them into low and middle income countries, or HDI countries, and high HDI countries. As you might guess, most of the studies were in the high income groups. We did some aggregate statistics, and this is women, and this is just each of the studies. And you can see there's some variability, some wiggle room, but not a tremendous amount between. And if you take a look at the overall total energy expenditure, it's pretty comparable between the two women at the end. Let's go back, let's go down. We see men, same thing. Fewer study amongst men, which is interesting. And then we do regression. So we're looking at predictors of that total energy expenditure using the aggregate data. We see that for men, weight and age are significant, as well as the interest output. We know that. But whether or not you're high or low income country is not different at all. There's no difference, nor is there any difference in the women. So we're beginning to get this picture of, maybe there's not a huge range in which humans live normally, free living, in this total energy expenditure picture. And physical activity is the same thing. This comes out of you guys' field. So we began to think about it, and there's really not a lot out there comparatively. And then we have Herman. So Herman came out his paper came out 3 years after ours had been published, and he got a whole hell of a lot more press than we did. New Yorkers compared to Hadza, it's pretty sexy, whereas we were just black women in Maywood and black women in Nigeria. Anyway, so Herman and I work together now, well, tangentially, but we will be getting back working together again, hopefully very soon. So we decided to look at maybe there's some factor in physical activity rather than just total calories. Is it patterns of physical activity? Is it intensity of physical activity that's associated with weight gain? So we started the Modeling the Epidemiologic Transition study. It was funded in 2009. We recruited our samples our cohort from 2010 going forward. Our sites sort of span this Human Development Index. We have low HDI in Ghana. We have Kailicha, which is a township outside of Cape Town or in Cape Town, depending upon who you ask. Kingston, the Seychelles, and the US. So you can see very different prevalences of obesity, very different mean BMIs. And this is just basically the structure of our project. Again, using that same paradigm, it's sort of we like to describe it as a migration study cross-sectionally, because we're looking at populations at different levels of development. We have collaborators in all of these institutions. So we decided to stick to our original hypothesis that physical activity is negatively inversely related to body fat cross-sectionally as well as follow-up. So this time we did doubly labeled water, but really only on a subset. Doubly labeled water is really expensive, really expensive. But we did stick accelerometers or motion sensors on everybody. And we also asked questionnaire data. I think I forgot that slide. That's all right. When we went to NIH to get funded, it didn't even get reviewed the first time through. And the only comment was, we didn't measure dietary intake. how are you going to do an energy balance study if you don't measure your energy intake? And we're just like, it's fraught with a few problems. So, but we added it in and got funded, and we have scads of useless data now. I mean, and it was probably, other than doubly labeled water, it was probably the most expensive piece to the whole study. So we have 2,500 people, and the data I'm going to show you right now is just for the 24-month follow-up. We've been following them with various rates of attrition since 2010, and I'll talk about the next piece of the puzzle coming in the next study. So 500 individuals from each of those 5 sites, approximately 50% male and 50% female. And so this is the other one. Let's just swap our urine samples. We think that happened with one of our collaborators. Okay. So here, the age range, they were young adults, 25 to 45 at baseline. You can see this is men, Ghana, South Africa, Jamaica, Seychelles, and the United States. And the reason we rank them like that is their HDI ranking from lowest to highest, okay, Human Development Index. We take a look at the data. What I will point out is for men, you have this really nice increase in mean BMI and mean percent body fat as you go from the low HDI country up to the highest. So when is obesity, what is the BMI for obesity? 30. So men in Maywood are, on average, obese. And these are women. Again, the average age 35-ish, which is appropriate for our sampling structure. Women don't follow cleanly the pattern of men at all. And that, I think, we find that women don't follow the pattern for a lot of physical activity, and the relationships we see with other outcomes very well either. So you can see in South Africa, as well as in Maywood, more than half of the women are obese, very high percent body fats. And then this is just the prevalence of overweight and obesity by site and sex. So you can see in my neighborhood, about 85% of the women are either obese or overweight. 60% are obese. And these are young women too. I mean, just remember this, 25 to 45. You can stop at any time if anyone has questions. Okay, so physical activity here is, I'm not going to show you much doubly labeled water data because we haven't published it yet. Manuscript sitting on my desk. So this is counts per minute, which is the intensity, average intensity over the wear period. So we had people wear the activity monitors for a week and bring the monitors back in. We got pretty good compliance, frankly. So you can see we have minutes of sedentary time. Depending upon the threshold of the intensity, you determine whether someone's sitting, whether they're doing moderate activity, vigorous activity, or the infamous MVPA, moderate to vigorous physical activity, in minutes per day. And then everyone in the world recommends more than 30 minutes of MVPA per day for good health. So this is among men. And you can see that fairly reasonable amounts, but it does definitely vary across our sites, right? If you take a look at women, very low in all of our sites, regardless of mean BMI or body weight. About the same amount of sedentary time as with the men, but not much, very, very extremely low levels of vigorous activity. And so if we take a look at, as I said, we're just looking at those first 4 years of our study and the first 2-year weight change. And this is the first line for men and women is a baseline healthy weight, which means they had a BMI of less than 25 kilograms. You can see that, as you might expect, there's a decline in that as we go up the Human Development Index. And men have, between half a kilo, between zero weight change to half a kilo per year. Women had quite varied all over the place, as they are for almost every measure we do. So we had still even, so you think about this, when I first presented the data from the women's study, people would say, but the women in Nigeria, they're malnourished. It's like, no, they're not. That's your perception from looking at National Geographic magazines. Not at all. But even so, in Ghana, just 10 years later, there was a very high proportion of overweight and obese women in Ghana relative to Nigeria. So now we're looking at the relationship between moderate to vigorous physical activity in minutes per day compared to weight change for both men and women. And as you can see, you say, oh, but there's a P of 0.05, but it's a positive association, okay? And then we said, well, maybe it's sedentary behavior. Maybe it's how many minutes per day we spend sitting around. There's absolutely no relationship whatsoever. Oh, I did include it in here. Okay, I didn't think I did. All right, so because of the cost of doubly labeled water and because of the restraints on dollar amounts at NIH, we only did a subset. 75 people per site with some drop-offs for bad data. You can forget all the top stuff because it really is comparable to the larger sample. But so total energy per day, we have a range from 2,300 in Jamaica, and I will say Jamaicans have lower energy expenditure, lower physical activity, not necessarily more sedentary time, but much lower measures than any of the other sites. So it went from about 2,300 per day up to 2,700 per day, calories per day. And again, that's a fairly narrow range. Okay. Activity energy expenditure here is, again, between the low of 500 calories per day up to about 900. Not, when you consider the size difference in some of these populations, it's kind of surprising. Oh, these are men and women combined. Okay, sorry. So that makes the narrow range even more interesting. And it's sort of regression to the mean, I guess. So now we're looking at the same metrics with the women's study. And again, this is men and women combined. And I did that because I was putting this together for a meeting and I didn't want to, I was lazy. But it's the same for both men and women. There's no association with total energy expenditure using a mixed effects random coefficient model of weight change. And it wasn't observed in either men or women. So these data have been adjusted for length of follow-up, obviously, baseline weight, age, and site. So if we take a look at resting energy expenditure, because again, in the doubly labeled water sample, we did measure resting energy expenditure and no associate. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a positive association observed in both women and men, which again is not what you are hypothesizing, right? So the higher your resting energy expenditure is, the more weight these folks gain. And then the one that is most likely to show an association we hypothesized, again, there was no association observed here in either men or women. And the different color dots just stands for the different sites. So because we used accelerometers and activity monitors, we were able to get a measure of cadence as well. There's been some of the exercise physiology people have said it's the rate at which you walk that's important. So you can get that with the activity monitors. So BMI is a function of cadence. So actually it was statistically significant, and looking at it in mean steps per minute, we had that inverse association, and this is a cross-sectional analysis. However, when we looked at it in relationship to subsequent weight change over 2 years, there was absolutely no association. So when you're doing all these kinds of comparisons, it could be a spurious, you're going to get one thing to pop up, or it could be real. So maybe we'll take a look at it going forward. Now I'm going to come back to, because we were required to collect dietary intake data in order to receive our funding, we used the gold standard. We used 2 24-hour, well, it should be 3, but we were in multiple sites and it's really expensive to do this. 24-hour dietary recalls, trained interviewers, trained dietitians entering the data. It was a nightmare. But then we had an estimate of daily caloric intake, 24-hour caloric intake, as well as other nutrients. And with doubly labeled water, if you're in energy balance over the time period that you're collecting your doubly labeled water samples, then energy intake equals energy expenditure. And that is now the gold standard to determine how valid dietary intake reporting or energy intake reporting is around the world. So this is the percent underreporting of those 24-hour recalls, averaged together in each of our sites by men and women. And it's also broken up by BMI status. So this would be healthy weight individuals with a BMI less than 25, individuals who would be considered overweight by these classifications, BMIs 25 to less than 30, and then BMIs over 30.
Just to be sure I understand, this is comparing 24-hour recall to the
Doubly labeled water. Using doubly labeled water as the gold standard. Okay?
Which
Yeah.
assumes energy balance.
Which we had weights pre and post.
So, weight, so you knew that was
Right.
a reasonable assumption.
And these people they couldn't be on a weight loss diet or anything like that. So, yeah.
So this is just whether or not they underreported, not like they underreported by 60%.
No, they underreported by 60%.
Oh.
This is the mean percentage underreporting by BMI group by sex and site. So what does that tell you about our gold standard for measuring energy intake? Well, other than doubly labeled water. There's 2 things it tells you. What?
Well, this is extremely inaccurate.
Okay.
How much data are there like this? This I find to be very interesting.
There's reported
Lots.
But-
There's
But
lots.
the degree, sorry,
Comparing 24-hour recall to doubly labeled water.
There's a fair amount of literature on that. Comparing them to food frequency questionnaires, comparing it to diet histories, blah, 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 blah. Or semi-quantitative food.
But it's systematically related to BMI, right? So the
That's
heavier
the
the
other
BMI,
thing. Exactly.
the bigger the underreporting, so it's going to work against
Right.
finding relationships.
Exactly. Amongst.
I mean, not everywhere, but like definitely.
Well,
South
I mean, that's
Africa,
because there were
Ghana,
no
US.
obese men
Yeah.
in Seychelles or South Africa or Ghana. But yeah, there's obviously a couple of places where it's a little less clear, but it's striking, and that relationship with BMI is held up. This supports other literature on that. It's very much true. If you think about how 24-hour recalls are obtained and then converted into numbers, there's every step of the way there's potential for problems. And then you may have populations that aren't really good at quantifying things. Oh, like all of them. I mean, seriously. So those students in their own self-reported data, especially dietary, and I would argue physical activity as well, I forgot that slide, I'm quite sure, though it might pop up, look at it with a jaundiced eye. I mean, don't take those data as rock solid at all, no matter how many times it's replicated.
Or just have a very, very, very good reason for doing it in the first place. Because like you said.
We can argue that perhaps we can get patterns. We can find out without quantifying. I will say, in all honesty or full disclosure, I am a signatory on a commentary that says we can't use dietary data for quantitative purposes.
Yeah, so I think food frequency is very, okay, you kind of have a reasonable diet, but we would never, I agree with you that calories are impossible to.
I would argue that almost any quantitative output, whether it's, milligrams of vitamin A, etc. This argues, and believe me, nutritional epidemiologists have spent the last 20 years developing statistical methods to correct these data. The commentary on one of the signers on says that's not appropriate, So that's my take-home message for this. Be careful when you see that. And virtually every, stuff gets into the lay media all the time. Nutrition everyone is interested in it. And so many of the backstories around these, New York Times articles or USA Today is based on self-reported data. So,
Yeah, and beyond that, that's the nutrition literature and its connections to health is one of the classic examples of why people say, like, now I can't eat eggs, but then they said before I couldn't eat eggs, or now I can eat butter
Exactly.
before that. It's this kind of thing that fuels that lack of confidence in this area, but also like science more generally. So
it definitely has not helped the case of science as a whole, frankly. And coming as a nutritionist. Okay, I just wanted to show you that we're not the only people who've found no relationship between physical activity, energy expenditure, and subsequent weight gain. The PIMAs, now they found an inverse association in a separate cohort following that first 1988 paper, and so they stand by it. I was at our American Heart Association meeting showing the women's study data, and one of the researchers, who's now a good friend of mine, but stood up and said, you obviously have interpreted your data wrong. Because we know that resting energy expenditure is associated with weight gain. It's like, okay. I'm not good at rebuttals. And so it's like, okay, Caroline, I'll take your word for it. But also they found no association, well, sort of, but it's being driven by resting energy expenditure with total energy expenditure or physical activity, right? Everyone has different acronyms. This is more recent. This is a paper that Dale, my PhD advisor, was the consultant on. And in children, there's no association found. And this was recently published, like a couple years ago. So we're not the only people. We're not crazy. I was telling Liz, I've been raked over the coals at sports science, sports medicine meetings, and as invited speakers, I think, so I could be the target. But Herman's always been next to me, so and I'm a bigger target than he was for sure, but size-wise, not population-wise. So I want to say why this is important from a public health viewpoint. We are not getting healthier in the United States. We are not getting healthier in Maywood in particular. Again, Maywood is where I live and breathe. This is my community. So this is comparing Richard's original study, that beautiful acronym ICSHIB. It rolls right off the tongue. It's beautiful. I like mine better, METS. If anyone knows physical activity data, METS also stands for metabolic equivalence and exercise work. But you can see, so I pulled out the data from ICSHIB, which was a much wider age range, and looked at some of the predictors or the conditions. So amongst men over these 20 years, BMI increased by 3.5 units. Among women, almost 5 units. The proportion of hypertension has doubled in both places, and the proportion of obese individuals has. So this is why understanding where to put your public health message is really important, I think. And then I'm just going to show you guys have already seen all these. This is Herman's stuff, and as I said, we're working together. We have a couple of papers together, but we are working together. He's got these things, doesn't he? The animation things. Hey, all right. So this is the model of energy expenditure that is accepted. The more physical activity you do, the more total energy expenditure you will expend, right? So, right. So that's a standard model. It's very reasonable, and again, these are Herman's slides, right?
now, wait, are you questioning A to B, physical activity and total
Yes.
energy expenditure, that part?
Yes.
Or just,
No, this part, well, all of the pieces.
right, I follow B to C
Yeah, no,
based
but,
on your data.
all right,
But
but this
isn't
is
that
sort
a
of-
matter of physics?
So we think,
Yeah.
yeah, first law of thermodynamics, actually. Where are we? Here, man. Oh, no, here we go, sorry. Alright, so this is the terms constrained total energy expenditure theory. And our data support it, and we have a paper published in Current Biology a couple of years ago supporting it as well. You kind of have to look at the data with squinty eyes a little bit to see the model. But what the theory is, and this hopefully is what we'll explore as we keep going, that the body adapts to those high levels of physical activity and it keeps that total energy expenditure within a certain parameter. Not, obviously, if you're doing Le Tour de Shore. Absolutely not. So this was actually published in Current Biology 2016, I think. So this is what we hope to figure out how to tease apart. And what are the other bits that could be influenced? Right. So energy allocation gets shifted when you have continued high levels of physical activity. And Herman's argument is that this is actually healthier, improving, because your physical activity, and this is what everyone takes away when they first hear our data. Oh, I don't have to go to the gym anymore. Wrong. The more physical activity you do, the better off you are in other parameters, not weight necessarily, but other parameters of good health. Right, so he's questioning that, that's fine. Okay, so these are some conclusions, I hope. Total resting physical activity energy expenditure isn't associated with weight change prospectively in 2 of our cohorts across a wide range of environments and baseline body weights. Neither moderate to vigorous physical activity nor sedentary behavior nor any other way you want to parse out that activity monitor data is associated with weight change. Measures of cadence are cross-sectionally but not weight change. Energy intake is significantly underreported in all of our sites. And obesity and negative sequelae are increasing. My argument is public health, we need to understand whether it's energy in or energy out that's driving this obesity epidemic. You want your public health, and unfortunately it's not the case, you want your public health policies to be empirically based. If you put out there a message that you have to get out to control your weight or to lose weight, you need to be physically active, as all the guidelines are, 30 minutes a day or 150 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and you see no change in yourself, that is a message that's going to be lost. And instead of saying, you need to do this because it will fix your heart, you need to eat less. But guess who has a big lobby, and guess who doesn't have a big lobby at the public health associations? The food industries have big lobbies. And as I was telling Liz, as those 2 of the groups who have consistently torn us apart in print and in meetings are bought and paid for by the Coca-Cola company. And they were exposed 3 years ago now on the front page of the New York Times, as a matter of fact. So I felt very vindicated, I'll tell you right now. But the public health policy implications could be significant. We don't have much money for preventive health. Lower and middle income countries have even less. And I have colleagues who work with me on this project who are still telling township women to get out and walk to lose weight. And have you read our old data? Okay, so we need to figure out where we focus the money, what degree of regulation, if any, is needed. We talked about autonomy versus public health. It's difficult. How should communities be redesigned, if they need to be redesigned? And how might countries early in the stages of the epidemiologic transition utilize this information to guide policy. And this came out last fall, and it's so true. When I first started going to Jamaica in 1994, there was Popeye's chicken, a couple of them. Now you drive down Old Hope Road in Kingston, the entire west side of the street is fast food restaurants, all of them. Ghana, never saw a fast food restaurant until recently, or they were homegrown. So, and this article really nicely points out that these traditional patterns are being displaced by commercially produced fast foods. Here, but they're symbols of status. It's not just they're easy, they taste good because they've got lots of fat and salt, but in a lot of lower and middle income countries, they're really a symbol of status, as is, unfortunately, being overweight. And these are my colleagues in each of our sites. And with that, I'm done. Any questions? Bill?
Amy, really fabulous stuff. And I guess my big picture question, sort of following on what you were just talking about, has to do with where you see the field of nutritional science go. Because it seems to me, for a long while, especially early on with the WA water work, there was a real disconnect in the nutritional science literature. You had you and Dale and many working in DLW basically showing what the lie of reported dietary intents were, while most of the rest of nutritional science was likely going on their way, reporting energy intakes out in 3 decimal places.
Right.
It seems now, with many of the papers that you've been part of, there is a healthy back and forth and really a dialogue going on between nutritional epidemiologists and folks in the energetics world. Where do you see this ultimately leading?
I think I almost see it leading to the death of nutritional epidemiology.
I was wondering if you
I really do. It's gotten every paper that comes out of certain groups, they spend half the paper justifying the use of these self-reported tools. I'm not saying there's no use for them, but quantitatively, I think there's no use. And I think it will. Think about nutritional epidemiologists. They are the masters of statistical methodology because they have had to be. They've had to develop all these methods to deal with faulty data.
Right.
So I would not recommend any young person to go into nutritional epidemiology. That's my take on it.
Yeah. Well, this was great, and it's got me thinking about a lot here. And one thing I'm trying to wrap my brain around is just the overall homeostatic process of stable weight, right? So if weight is not changing year to year to year, and if we consume on average, say, 1 million calories a year, then we're expending about 1 million calories, right? And somehow that our bodies are managing that.
Right.
And if you eat more, right, and you still maintain a stable weight, it means that you're expending more. And you're either becoming more physically active, right? So maybe that underlies some of these positive relationships that you see, or there's a bigger thermic effect of food or whatever, right? So if you don't have stability and you start to inch up weight, right, what that's really showing is that homeostatic process is kind of breaking down, or that there's more mobility or whatever you want to call it in the set points. Like it's allowing it to sort of creep up. And so I guess my question, I'm kind of rambling here, but what is the per day caloric imbalance that needs to really be explained here to account for like some of the big BMI differences that you see across some of your populations? Is it like 10 calories a day? Is it and if it's that, is it really just a matter of the set point not working, the homeostatic process is not working? At a very fine level.
Two different issues. First of all, that imbalance they've looked at it 6 ways to Sunday, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with Kevin Hall. Yeah, so he's a mathematical modeler who works at the NIH, and the last time Herman and I had to defend this was at the Obesity Society meeting in October, and Kevin Hall was also on the panel. So they have every gadget known to man, including these great room calorimeters with exercise cycles, and they can capture every every joule that's expended in theory. And he says there's a $600 calorie missing in that they can't find. They don't know where it's being burned off to maintain weight in these, with exercise, with strict regimens and everything.
So
Flip
that's
side.
a measurement issue, right? That's not.
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think it is a measurement issue. I don't know if it's real, and he's only done it in like 8 people. So I mean, and I don't know how it translates to reality. There's another group that again looked at a bunch of double labeled water papers and came up with about 400 to 500 calories per day. Then there's another group of people who says it's only about 50 calories.
No, but I guess my question was more like if you just look at the amount of weight and you know that each gram of fat is 9
Yeah,
kilocalories.
well, there's some question
Or
about
whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
What kind of caloric imbalance is required to drive the differences yearly? And I
It's
have
very
no idea.
small. It's on the order. I
So-
would argue less than 50 calories per day,
Okay.
which again, for free living measurements, is well within measurement error of
Right.
any method you use.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think it's much. So these missing 600 calories, we'll see where
Yeah, that's.
that turns out.
I have one more quick thing. Do we have any idea if there are any population differences in the kind of stability of set points? Like, do we have any evidence that populations vary in their ability to kind of increase their body weight set point and start protecting a higher body weight?
Well, you have to determine whether you believe in the concept of set point
Yeah.
to begin with. I don't know if we have any of those data.
Okay.
Yeah, but I will say the lack of variability in total energy expenditure around the world, it's kind of like the lack of variability really around how much percentage of calories comes from protein most populations get. I feel like there are those homeostatic mechanisms. I don't know what they are. Yeah.
I guess this is, I'm maybe totally out there, but I'm wondering if one way that you could explain this kind of broad pattern that seems to have no single discernible reason behind it is if maybe instead of there being this like one homeostatic set points, what you're seeing is systems that are comprised of a bunch of different pathways, and they're being altered differently in different ways, and it's not so much that there's one central regulator that's being disrupted, but sort of a various different types of cascading processes leading to, maybe some of these things that we think are real certain, and again, I have no idea about this, but the idea that a gram of fat equals this many calories, well, do we know that that's exactly the same for every person at every point in time, or is there, in these biochemical pathways, is there room for some sort of kind of like with how brown fat works, and it's like this uncoupling of a protein that's allowing some of the calories to just be burned.
Sure.
Is heat.
Yeah.
And is
Oh,
that-
I think it's undoubtedly that way. I mean, take a look at hypertension. I mean, it's the most complex system with any number of feedbacks and alternate pathways and all that. And I think we also have to remember, any set point, it might not be regarding weight gain. It's much more. I mean, we see much better adaptation with weight loss. So evolutionarily, maybe we didn't. Never thought about the other side of the equation, I mean, we know that the body adapts very well for a time to undernutrition or under caloric intake. We've got that documented, 6 ways to Sunday. So it may just be that our species didn't develop the other type of set points or homeostatic mechanisms. I don't know. I'm a simple nutritionist, actually, so.
I have just a quick technical question. How much of these patterns that you're interpreting, your colleagues are interpreting, how much do they rely on adjustment for body composition? So you just sort of said, just.
No,
so is that,
it's more body size, except for resting energy expenditure,
Okay.
which really you need
And
to
is it
address.
BMI, adjusted by BMI?
Weight.
By weight,
Yeah.
by body weight. But weight can mean a lot of different things in terms of the composition,
It
right?
can, but Dale's done a bunch of examinations of this with physical activity. Absolutely, it can mean a whole ton of things.
Mhm.
Or physical activity, energy expenditure, details. but it really, it's almost proportional to weight. I mean,
Mhm.
there is a slight non-zero intercept,
Mhm.
but for weight, it's much better than for example, resting energy expenditure.
And would that relationship, albeit perhaps a little bit non-zero, be the same non-zero across all these contexts?
It seems as though,
Yeah.
yes, but, you know, I'm not gonna swear to that,
Yeah.
because I don't know if Dale's actually examined it in a whole bunch of populations. I don't think he's used our data to look at that, but, yeah, it's, so the adjustment issue is, you have to, I mean, bigger body costs takes more energy to move, to maintain, you know, there's just no way around that. Otherwise, yeah, there's just no way around it.
Well, I mean, you raise the prospect that the first law of thermodynamics might not apply, so maybe there are.
Well, I didn't say that. Oh my goodness, that's that.
That's my
This
takeaway
is
from
being
your
recorded,
talking.
by the
Oh
way.
no, this is absolutely not what I meant. No, definitely not. I am not one of those people who think a calorie is not a calorie. So, all right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Kill this.
Oh, and what I didn't say is our next study I meant to mention is Dr. Laura Dugas has gotten a very large 5-year grant to look at the microbiome in relationship to energetics and obesity risk through the mechanism of short-chain fatty acid production in the same cohort. So that'll be very exciting. It's just started, so look forward to new stuff.
That's great.
All right, great.
So much.
Yeah.